So good evening, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful first day. On behalf of our room, let us welcome our friends who are joining us live streaming on Facebook. You're dialing into the opening evening, the first keynote of the annual gathering of the Next Practice Institute, which is the professional development arm of Mobius Executive Leadership. And I'm Amy Fox, one of the founders and the CEO. I'm delighted to welcome everybody this evening to a tremendously special, pretty rare opportunity to study with one of the seminal thinkers in our field. I went back to my notes when I was anticipating this NPI, as I do every year, and I found this original list I had of the keynotes that I hoped over the 10 years of NPI we would somehow manage to have and have the privilege of hosting, and the very first name on that list says Ed Schein. So here we are, making a dream come true. This evening I have a wonderful privilege also of introducing the introducer of the Scheins, our dear, dear friend, Xander Grashaw, who's a Mobius senior expert, a thought leader in the field of adaptive leadership, a pioneer in using coaching skills and facilitation skills to work with social entrepreneurs and people in the public sector who are actively trying to build a more just and environmentally sane society. I could not be more thrilled than to introduce a master practitioner in our field, to introduce a master theorist and his son. So Xander, thank you for being with us, and it's a pleasure to turn it over to you.
Great. So this is a real treat because all of us stand on the shoulders of giants, and Ed Schein and his work is what is the foundation of what so many of us are practicing. Adaptive leadership, my co-authors in that framework are intimate with this set of ideas. Anyone who has ever used the idea of organizational culture or thought of that phrase comes from Ed. Anyone who considers themselves a process consultant has come from this body of work, and so I am so excited that we're going to get to have a conversation with Ed and his son Peter tonight. They are remote, so you will see them on the screen. In a moment, let's show their faces and give them a warm welcome and cheer for us to get to spend some time with them. They can. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear us?
In the room, you have 200 or so transformational catalyst coaches, facilitators who are just here to thank you for your work. The evolution of your work is beautiful, so we're going to hear about that. And Peter, both your work and what you're doing in Silicon Valley and how you have worked together. All of us want to understand both the evolution of your work and how just to have a healthy relationship with your dad. So I want to ask you a few questions, and then I just want to give you some room to kind of walk through some of your framework. The first thing I want to know is, do you go to the same barber?
We used to, but not anymore.
Okay, yeah. In any family, there's family drama. But beyond the family drama, Peter, what does your father stand for?
Well, I think he stands for listening. I think if I have to think of anything that I value and have for 50-something years, it's that he was always willing to listen to whatever I had to say. I'd go on a rant or a diatribe, and I never got judged. I never got condemned or undermined for my thoughts. I was always just able to express myself, and I can't think of anything I could value more in a father and a mentor than just that. I could say what was on my mind and hope it would lead to something constructive.
That's beautiful. And in Ed, in listening to your son, what is one of the major things you've learned from him?
Well, the most wonderful thing from my point of view is the discovery that his creativity and his perspective on things is both different and exciting. So that in working together, we have a lot of overlap, but it has really amazed me how often Peter comes up with a different perspective that turns out to be deeper and more creative than what I had been thinking about. That's the thing I admire most about him.
Beautiful. And there's been such an evolution of your work. I think we want to start, though, with understanding the origin, Ed, of some of your process and work. Can you give us just a little bit of the framing of how you came to this and the roots that gave us so much fruit later on?
Yeah, I would very much like to do that, because I do think I have always evolved or worked from certain biases. And these biases show up in what I consider to be the major events in my intellectual life, which started really with getting my PhD at Harvard at a time when anthropology, sociology, clinical psychology, and social psychology had been merged into one department. So I am labeled a social psychologist, but I feel I am much more a sociologist, anthropologist. And this is an important bias because I get very impatient with individual psychology, particularly the obsession with traits. What's the perfect leader? Always trying to figure out what the individual needs to be. When I discovered first in my PhD and then later when Dr. McGregor asked me to go to a T group program, which I knew very little about, but Kurt Lewin had created that program, and in the 50s, I attended my first 3-week workshop in 1958 and was blown away by the discovery of how much goes on between people in groups and in all sorts of relationships, and how much the context, the social context, really matters in trying to understand anything. Way more important than personality and these various, I love Briggs Myers, but it's relatively useless for explaining anything, to understanding the social context in which someone is working. And then the first major book, which has sort of disappeared from the scene, I did with Warren Bennis and Dave Berlew and Fritz Steele, was called Interpersonal Dynamics. And I think that signaled what has remained to be a major, major bias in my thinking, is that it's all about conversation, it's all about relationships. And so the most important recent work really has been the evolution of a kind of a better understanding of what is a relationship, what are the different levels of relationship, and how does that affect what we call change or influence or leadership, all the things we're working on all the time. So the bias toward sociology, the bias against individual theorizing, the bias toward, I guess another implication of relational thinking is a bias toward helping. I learned early in my MIT career as a consultant that explaining things to people, telling them all your wisdom, didn't work very well. People were polite. I got my pay, but I never produced any change. Whereas caring for people, trying to understand, particularly the people in Digital Equipment Corporation who were always fighting, beating on each other. Horrible. I kept trying to civilize them, make them be polite. And not until I understood that a first generation technology being invented by a group of very dedicated, passionate engineers is going to lead to a lot of fighting because nobody knew the truth. And the only way I could really be helpful to them was to make it easier for them to communicate as they were fighting. And that's really what process consultation is, to get into their process and help them do it, rather than impose my process or my theories or my way of thinking. That philosophy is deeply ingrained, and I'm sorry to say a lot of leadership theories have kind of abandoned that and have fallen back, particularly the point about diagnosis versus intervention. The minute I see a theory that starts with diagnosis, I'm already worried about it, because I think diagnosis is intervention. Everything you say to the client, from the very moment you meet them or have them on the phone, is an intervention. And therefore, my goal when I'm first talking to somebody is to try to understand and care and figure out how to be helpful. Diagnosis comes automatically secondarily out of trying to figure out what's going on. But the notion that I have to figure out what's going on before I intervene is, to put it very bluntly, nonsense. So now you know one of my major biases, and maybe that's enough background. I could elaborate, but I thought I'd lead you to that particular point.
Great. Thank you, Ed. And we will have time for questions later on, and so I'm sure we'll come back. Many of us...
I hope somebody questions that.
Great.
Actually, Dan, if I could add a quick story just to amplify this a
Please,
little bit. We started working together at the end of 2015. And Ed said to me, if we're going to do this, you have to go do a T group. And I thought, well, sure. My wife, when my wife was at Stanford Business School, while I was at Northwestern Business School, and Stanford's always had their touchy-feely and always done their T groups thing, and I didn't have any of that. And good sort of brass tacks Midwest Kellogg Business School. So I was happy to have that opportunity, and so I did 4 days of highly intense, dialogue with about 8 other people. It was really a quite powerful experience. I don't know if we have any NTL folks in the audience, but their human interaction lab is what they now call the full-on T group. And it was very powerful, and it was very focused on each and every one of us. But Ed asked me after how much of the 4.5 days or whatever it was focused on how the group built itself, how the group created its own identity, how the group created its culture. Because once we got started, we were a group that was forming its own identity and culture. And I had to really think about it and say, no, I think we spent 4 days talking about each other as individuals and less than a half a day talking about the group and how the group was performing. And so, Ed can make the comment on the historical context of that, but considering when I was a little kid playing around, in the playgrounds in Bethel, Maine, when Ed was in these group dynamics sessions that became NTL and became, the NTL programs as we know them today, it did seem like there was a resumption of this bias on the individual and away from the group, certainly in the experience that I had. Ed, do you want to?
Well, I think group relationship, what the T group does leads to a very central point that is another bias. When you think about what really undermines relationships, it's the concept of professional distance between roles. And the culture, the larger culture, of course, wants to put us all into roles, because that's how society works best. When we all know what our role is keep our distance from each other, learn to be polite and honest and within the context of the role, and then discover that if we're dealing with a complex problem, no role is defined well enough to tell us what to do. We then have to become people in the roles. We have to drop professional distance. And how to do that, we learn how to do that in a T group, where we suspend the cultural rules of everything has to be very proper and nice, and begin to explore what happens if we actually tell each other something of what's on our mind that culturally we're not supposed to share. That opening leads to authentic relationships.
Peter, I just can't imagine what it's like growing up with a process consultant as your dad. Did you just talk about everything? And how did you go from growing up in this environment to doing your work in Silicon Valley as a way to bring your work into the conversation?
Well, I mean, I guess the first comment is none of us know what it's like to grow up in another family. So I in a way, I can't answer that because it's all I had, and I've now grown to appreciate it. But I think honestly, we sort of joke that when Ed was writing the first culture book, I was in social anthropology undergrad at Stanford, and my sister was about to start anthropology PhD at Cal. And so, social anthropology is kind of the family business, and it just took me a while to realize it. I had to go, on my prodigal son journey through the craziness of Silicon Valley for 30 plus years before I realized that I really wanted to be back in the family business. But, I will also say that a lot of what I did in Silicon Valley does connect fairly directly to this in a couple ways. One, when I was at Apple as, first sort of job out of business school, we were creating stuff and inventing stuff, online services, internet, wireless, all of these things that really people hadn't seen before. So what we had to do was create, narratives and metaphors and ways of describing stuff that people didn't understand intrinsically because the technology was brand new. And I realized that I was tapping a lot of my sort of social science skills far more than any technical acumen I had. I was not trained as an engineer, so actually I didn't really have any technical acumen. All I had was language and metaphor and description. And I do think that my training as a social anthropologist in undergrad was very helpful for that. The other thing that I will say is my last sort of formal multi-year gig at Sun Microsystems was in corporate development. And while corporate development can be thought of as sort of M&A and synergies and accounting, I was much more focused on we're bringing a group of people into a larger organization, and are they going to be able to get along? Are they going to fit? Is the cultural fit, usually a checkoff item in some M&A checklist, but probably the only thing that ultimately really matters, because if there's no cultural fit, people are going to leave, and you don't acquire companies to have people leave. So I found myself very drawn to that process of corporate development, not because it had great accounting synergies or was accretive, but because we were merging cultures together, and that was very challenging and exciting. So I think the dinner table conversations have stayed with me, and now we're just much more explicit in sharing what we learned and are writing books together and doing consulting together.
How did it start, though? How did you go from having two different practices to merging It started with one book forward, or what was the process of
Well,
integration?
it probably, we could say it started with Ed moving out here to Palo Alto, a mile and a half from where I live in Menlo Park. So we've had a lot of, father-son time together that we had always found time to make for each other, but now it was, we were living near each other and we're really sharing at a deeper level. But the other thing for me, honestly, was I was at that point, entering my 50s. And, there's an age bias in Silicon Valley. So all of my experience, as valuable as I thought it was, my job prospects, honestly, had narrowed in thinking I could just go be another product manager at a big technology company. I'd done that for years. But I faced up to the fact that experience is worth one thing, but sort of training in the latest technology, if you will, which you might get from a 30-year-old engineer, it's a different animal. The place has changed, and I had to sort of accept that and start saying, well, what would I value? What would be important to me? And that's when Ed and I started talking about, A, what would be valuable if we combined forces together, and B, what were some of the things that were kind of getting under our skin about where things were at in Silicon Valley. I brought a lot of that, and Ed brought so much of his experience with, he mentioned DEC, but also with Apple and a bunch of other engagements he had had with technology companies. So we started sharing ideas, and that's what sort of brought what was, a sort of structural combination and made it much more of a philosophical and spiritual combination.
And Ed, of all the things that you were studying and had access to and thinking about, can you explain why the focus on humility and being humble, and why are your thoughts has evolved?
There are a number of historical factors that I think play into this. First of all, as some of you may know, I had grown up in Europe. My father was Czech, my mother was German. I was born in Switzerland, and I was an only child. So 6 years in Switzerland, totally spoiled, best German toys ever. And then the Swiss and the Czechs had a falling out, and my father's green card was revoked, and he had to become a physics professor somewhere else. And at that time, 1934 it was, the people who wanted physics and building it up were China and the Soviet Union. So we went to Odessa for 3 years because my father could do his cosmic ray research in the Caucasus on Mount Elbrus. And we were spoiled there because the Soviet Union was cruel to its own citizens, but very lavish with foreigners. We had a big apartment, good salaries, good stores. And then, of course, after 3 years there, my father realized that Stalin was coming. I had learned some Russian by then, but never to write it. So we had to leave there, leave everything behind, including my good German toys. So off we went to Prague for a year, and by then the University of Chicago and this very important physics professor, Arthur Compton, had evolved this program with foundation support of bringing European scientists to the US. So my father had, by 1938, developed a relationship with the University of Chicago. So I arrived there at age 10 with zero English, and I mean zero. I spoke German and a little bit of Czech and a little bit of Russian. And I think learning how to get along in the schoolyard at age 10 is a humbling experience. You realize that you have to figure out on your own how things work and do the best to fit in. Fortunately, my my athletic coordination was good enough that I could fit into the games, and became very Americanized, much more than my parents. But in that process, I developed a lot of perspective. I had already been in what, 3, 4 different countries. And so even as a 10-year-old, you realize there is no one truth, that there are lots of truths, lots of languages. So then to come into social sciences and say, well, there is psychology, but there's also anthropology, and there are different ways of looking at things, is itself both, it's a paradox. I'm both arrogant and humble, because by knowing all these different perspectives, I often think I know a lot more than people who haven't had the benefit of living in several cultures, learning several languages. And at the same time, that same arrogance of I know all this stuff makes you realize that just broadcasting it isn't going to help anybody. So if you want to get along, you've got to be helpful, you've got to fit in. And you then learn to curb your insights and your own impulse to want to tell everybody what's going on because you think you know. And then you discover that you actually don't know as much as you thought you knew. And at the same time, you're trying to be helpful. So I think this whole process, listening, a persona, was a learned persona out of my experience. It was the only way to really get along, knowing a lot, and yet knowing that that knowledge is in itself of no value. That to get along with people, to teach people, you have to get involved with them and enable them to see what you think you already see. That's why I think diagnosis is such a dangerous thing. Diagnosis tempts you to trust your own wisdom, and it allows you to miss the reality of what's going on around you.
We want to hear more about the humble consulting in a moment, but it seems obvious that you're promoting humble consulting in a period of time in history that many would not regard as the most humble. That if you look at politics or media or social media, it sways more to the arrogant side than the humble side. So how do you position or think about humility in the face of what you're seeing around you?
I think the humility that we're now really talking about needs to be defined more precisely as here and now humility. It's not a personality trait. It's not an attitude toward life. I don't go around feeling humble. I go around trying to understand what's going on. And every so often I encounter a situation that doesn't explain itself. It's ambiguous. I don't know what's going on. At that moment, I have to be able to access what we're calling humble, here and now humility. It's a learned skill, if you will. Now, when you look at great leaders in history, you discover that some of the most seemingly arrogant, individualistic, autocratic people had precisely this skill. So in our Humble Leadership book, it's not accidental that I wanted the first case example to be Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. There's a man who is by most definitions a political autocrat, and yet if you know anything about his history, you realize that he and his 4 or 5 buddies who were educated in England understood together that if Singapore was going to go anywhere, it had to evolve into a developmental kind of city-state. And in order to do that, they created an economic development board, which I later studied. So that's how I got to know this history. And this economic development board as an organization was an unbelievably interesting mix of Western individualism and Eastern collaboration. The way you were a good officer in the Economic Development Board of Singapore was to be brilliant in being able to locate companies and talk them into coming to Singapore to invest in Singapore. At the same time, if you learn something that might help any of the other of those 50 or so officers of the EDB, you were negatively judged if you didn't immediately call them up and say, I've got something that might help you. So they became simultaneously this really amazing, non-corrupt government organization that created the Singapore Miracle, and Lee Kuan Yew created that. He didn't tell anybody what to do. He worked out with people what they as a society had to do. Now that also involved some rules. He knew that Western businessmen wouldn't come to Singapore if it was a dirty, sloppy, corrupt place. So he imposed very heavy rules politically to make sure that it would be squeaky clean. People arriving in Singapore, the best thing they could say was that, hey, this looks just like the Zurich airport. When people had that reaction, Singapore knew it was beginning to work. So here's Lee Kuan Yew, a really, truly humble leader. Can you tolerate that notion that an autocrat, that a political autocrat can be a humble leader?
I'm interested in people's reaction if they can fall in love with more autocrats. Maybe we'll come back.
Depends on whether they're also humble leaders.
Right.
See, that's the problem. Most autocrats are not. But we misjudge the autocracy and fail to see the humility. The best examples, of course, are in the military. The military right now is undergoing a huge change in its attitude toward what it means to be a senior officer. You know, if you take McChrystal's book, what is it called?
Team of Teams.
The Team of Teams. He's very blatant in saying, I'm still a general, but the people who know what to do next are down on the ground, and I have to let them make the decisions.
Yeah. Peter, I want to get your thoughts on this too, and I'm interested in this question of rules, because many people in the transformation space want to believe and experience freedom and flat organizations and tend to reject some hierarchy. And so help us think in the space of the role of rules or anything that you want about this process that would inform our thinking.
Yeah, well, I guess a couple things. One, I want to amplify what Ed said about hierarchy. We're not suggesting, frankly, nor do I think that Frederick Laloux is suggesting in his Reinventing Organizations book that it's hierarchy that goes away. It's how humans manage within hierarchy that changes. So we're very much of that. Something is in the air with all of these experiments within hierarchies to try to build ways of creating self-managed teams. So, but I think you're leading me to one of my favorite rants, and
go for it.
It's my rant about transparency and accountability, because we've sort of said in the last, call it a decade, that what we really need is more transparency. Transparency is a good thing. And that may be so if it's used as a tool and not a weapon. But so often, I think when we hear about transparency, particularly when we're talking about Washington, D.C., and what's happening even today, is transparency is this tool, or it's a set of rules applied because at some basic level, we don't trust the other side. We don't trust the other people. So we establish rules about transparency where we may be very democratic and fair, establishing what information we're going to share. But really what we're doing is we're saying we're going to agree on what we're going to share, we're going to share it, but that doesn't imply or doesn't require in any way that we trust the other people, whether it's, it's another political party or whether it's other people, different, functional parts of an organization. So, and accountability, the idea that we're going to hold people accountable if they don't share the information that they've agreed to share or accomplish some task that they've agreed to accomplish. I would prefer to say that we substitute transparency for openness, and we substitute accountability for responsibility. So the example I like to use particularly with transparency, is that if you establish these rules about how you're going to share information, that's great. You agree you're going to share that information. But so often, these days in particular, where we can all agree that the pace of change is accelerating, we use the military's VUCA term, but we all know that phenomenon, that things are getting more complicated, things are getting more uncertain, and complexity is part of our modern work life. But if we sort of accept that, and yet we've drawn rules around what information we're going to share, we're not going to have all the information that's valuable to make decisions. So in other words, we're going to set rules about getting at the known unknowns, to borrow the Donald Rumsfeld terms. We're going to get to the known unknowns because we've agreed that we're going to share that information. But what I'm more interested in is if we have a climate of openness, if we have agreed that we're going to be open with each other, and we through that have established an intrinsic trust in each other, then we're going to share information that wasn't in our rule, that we didn't establish a rule about sharing some piece of information alone. We are going to share information that might be pertinent because we believe that we trust each other enough that we're going to be open about it. So that's how we sort of get at the unknown unknowns. Or another way of putting it is we get at the answers to the questions we don't ask. You're in a group and somebody knows something, and if the only rule is that they're going to share information when asked, well, if they're not asked, that's not part of that transparency model. If they're responding to that transparency rule, then you get some of the information, but you may not get all of the pertinent information that you need to make the right decisions. So I'm more interested in people being open and trusting each other and getting at the unknown unknowns, because somebody has some piece of data out there that they didn't know they needed to share, but because they trust other people in the room and they know that they're trusted, they do share that information. And then we innovate, or we prevent an accident. We've moved beyond transparency in sharing information that's valuable, not just that was asked for.
Could I add an example that's in our Humble Leadership book? This Captain Marquet, who wrote this little book called Turn the Ship Around, taking over a submarine that had low morale and marginal performance. Apparently, what he decided to do, which perfectly, from my point of view, illustrates what Peter's talking about, he figured out that the people who really ran the submarine, just from his knowledge of Navy, were the chief petty officers. So when he first took over the submarine, he sat them around the table and said, I'd like to know whether you guys are satisfied with how this submarine is running. And then shut up. And of course, they didn't believe that this is what the captain really wants. He's probably got his hip pocket agenda. He's probably got all sorts of things. And so they didn't answer. He kept silent. He kept at the meeting saying, no, I really do want to know what you guys think. And they began slowly to answer the question. For example, the leave policy, getting off the submarine was all screwed up. You needed 6 levels of approval so people could never plan anything. And he knew immediately that the Navy did indeed have that rule, but he said, you know, if that's a problem, we can probably test whether we really need to enforce that rule in the way it's written. And they collectively decided to try doing the leave policy with just 2 levels of approval. And that worked, and it immediately changed the morale. And he used that philosophy of letting them bring up everything they saw, and it both enabled him to figure out what's going on and show how the hierarchy could or could not work with it. He's still the captain, they're still the chief petty officers, but they create a totally different climate of interaction around openness and trust from his decision to ask rather than start out with telling.
Ed, you look at relationships in some very specific ways. Can you sort of lay out the layers of relationship framework and how you tend to examine and initiate the work on relationships?
Well, it comes right out of culture studies. You know, if you look at societies around the world, you realize that every society has its norms of etiquette and how things are supposed to be. And that is the level 1 role-related set of rules about that enables us all to get along with each other as strangers in a day-to-day world. And when we're given roles, we know how to play those roles, the job descriptions tell us and so on. That's sort of the norm that every culture has, a role-based relationship system. We also know that below that, there is a kind of level of relationship which we call -1, which is domination. The guard in the prison, the boss of the sweatshop, the bully, those are level -1 dominating, coercive, brutal relationships that society doesn't officially condone, but it tolerates a certain amount of them and sometimes builds them into roles like prison guards and so on. So there's level -1 and level 1. And level 1 implies professional distance. We all stay in our roles, we all know what to do, and that works fine until life gets complicated. When the role doesn't tell you what to do because there was an accident or the problem is complicated, what adaptive leadership so ably defined as, you know, new kinds of situations that require new kinds of adaptation. For that, we need level 2. Level 2 is I'm still in my role, I'm still the boss, you're still my direct report, I'm the captain, you're the chief petty officer, but I don't know what to do in this particular situation. I don't know how to fix this problem without getting to know you, your information, and your skills. So the essence of level 2, as I see it, is you've got to get to know each other in the context of the work or whatever it is you're trying to do. Just role relationships do not reveal enough of the unknown unknowns to enable us to solve the problem. So level 2 is what we're frankly advocating as necessary for the VUCA world of tomorrow. Problems will not get solved if people don't develop open, trusting level 2 relationships. Now, level 3 is intimacy, friendships, close emotional relationships, lovers. But there may even be in between something we haven't written about, but people hearing these stories tell us there might also be, often in the work setting, when things really get complicated, you're a Navy SEALs team out on a mission, a group doing something very complicated. You may even have to slide a little bit toward level 3. You might even have to get to know each other at an even deeper level. You have to trust each other with your life and know exactly how each other functions, or the job won't get done. So level 3 may not always be possible or desirable, but we think the world is heading toward a level of complexity that level 2 relationships will be necessary everywhere. So what do I mean everywhere? The coach has to develop a level 2 relationship with the client. The consultant has to develop a level 2 relationship with the client. The boss with the subordinate. The team members with the other team members. Otherwise, things will not get open and trusting. Problems will not get solved. That feels like Sisyphus going up the mountain, because people prefer the professional distance. It's easier, it's more comfortable. And yet we're saying, if you stay at that level, if you don't make an effort to get to know your people, problems won't get solved. And just I'll close this with one quick story. I used to teach the Sloan Fellows, who were the up and coming executives at MIT. And in every class, there was always the complaint among the young budding executives that they never could get to understand what was going on in their plant or in their machine shop at the level of the union and the workers. And there was always some percentage, somewhere between 10 and 25% of others who said, wait a minute, I never had that problem. I got along beautifully with all my direct reports and with the union and so on. They always told me exactly what was going on. And then the others would say, well, what did you do to make that happen? And as I look back and listen to their stories, they got to know their people as people. They went beyond the role. They collapsed the professional distance. They said, hey, we're just human beings here in these jobs. So let's behave like human beings and tell each other what's really going on, and things will work out better. I've never forgotten that. And the sad truth of it is, there was always a small percentage of managers who were able to tell those stories. So what's wrong with our system that it's 10 to 25% of managers who know how to get along with their people, and the rest somehow are baffled by the distance?
And Xander, I'd like to add an idea too that we didn't talk about in the Humble Leadership book explicitly, but it's sort of come up in some of our discussions about this, that you could sort of, if you take this model, level -1 up to level 3, if you inverted it, you could sort of be describing the process of bureaucratization. That if you think of a startup, spending 20 hours, a pair of people, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, spending 20 hours a day together working on something that was really important. They knew each other really well. They had an intimate relationship. They could finish each other's sentences. And over time, as an organization scales, is there inevitable process that we have to at least be aware of, that we're going to move more as we scale up and scale out, that we're going to move more and more to interchangeable role relationships, not whole person to whole person personal relationships, because that's what scale requires. It requires that we be able to kind of treat treat humans as nodes in an organization, or treat teams of humans as nodes, and therefore just sort of inevitably we end up moving away from the human relationships between people in small teams to these sort of functional node relationships on a big network diagram. Yeah. And I'm not suggesting that organizations end up as level -1, where it's a dominance-oriented bureaucracy. But are we describing something as we move from these intimate relationships of very small teams all the way through to the massive global scale relationships, which end up being reinforcing professional distance? Because it seems like, how can you possibly scale these kinds of personal relationships with each other if you've got 10,000 people in 30 countries across the globe? And our argument is, no, you actually can scale those organic human relationships with each other, because most people spend their work lives interacting closely with enough people that they can develop those personal relationships. But it has to be valued at the top of the organization. If you don't have leaders, being that way, then you can't really expect the front line to behave that way as well. So again, we're just sort of playing with that idea that if you think about this relationship framework, can you sort of apply it in some senses to the process of bureaucratization? And if you think about it in those terms and start to say, wait a second, we're transitioning, we're regressing, as it were, to level 1. We need to establish ways of bringing whole people to work. Maybe this is part of the something is in the air that Lalou talks about, of people recognizing that they need to be more human at work. One of the implicit ideas in the Humble Leadership book is that we're all worried about AI and automation. Well, maybe as Ed has a little sticky on his wall that says the real danger is not that machines will become human, it's that humans will become machines. Well, we have to worry about bureaucratization, allowing ourselves to sort of leave our whole person at home so that we can go be our role at work. That is not going to be a good way to solve complex problems, in the VUCA future.
So you've given us a bunch of frameworks. You've given us some images. I'm going to spend some time thinking about humble autocrats and intimate Navy SEALs. But can you give us some practices? I mean, you're talking to a room of people who are the advisors, strategic confidants, transformation, change consultants, to people who have the power to move from -1 to 3. So what are some practices that you want to leave us with? And we'll have some questions in a bit. But can you give us some practices that you found to be particularly useful that you want this audience to have?
Well, the one I'll start with is the practice of realizing that everything I do is an intervention. I have to recognize that my words have an impact on others, and therefore I can choose words that are helpful, or I can choose words that are neutral, or I can choose words that are aggressive. That's my choice. And I think I have learned that if I'm trying to be helpful, if I want to get along, if I want to influence people, I have to intervene initially in a helpful way, which means what, for example, the improv people have so helpfully pointed out is that instead of using the word but all the time, I agree with you, but, that you put the word and in there. I agree with you, and it leads to this further thought. That kind of simplistic notion turns out to be very fundamental. The way we converse with each other can be helpful in opening or can immediately close things down by the way what we say and how we say it. And as one of the chief executives in my Sloan class said to the Sloans, is to remember that everything happens through conversation. You know, there is no other mechanism than conversation. So I believe the most important practical point of view is to start thinking about how you handle your own conversations with each other, with the people above you, below you, to the side of you. What are your motives? What are you unconsciously thinking about? What are your biases? Get to know your own intentions and then see whether the interventions you make verbally fit those intentions, or whether you're actually, as one of my favorite Pogo quotes is, everywhere I go to and ruin everything.
I want to share a turn of phrase that I heard probably for the first time maybe 10 or 15 years ago in a product review session, and I think it was probably at Sun Microsystems, which was, I don't disagree with you, but. And I just thought, and I continue to think, wow, is that really a constructive way to frame that? I don't disagree with you, but. So to Ed's point, and my wife is a non-faculty administrator at the Stanford Business School. And she often shares with me, yes, and is absolute rule there. I mean, it's that they're very, very clear that they want to move the ball forward and is critical to that. And I think that's enlightening. This is the business school that's known for being pretty innovative. And yes, and is clearly a value, not I don't disagree with you, but. So, so I also wanted to add in this practices idea, we're also in a place where a lot of people talk about mindfulness. And there's one thing that Ed has talked about that I'll share and he can elaborate on. But then there's another one that I'll start with, which is I was always very intrigued hearing the stories about Google. And I think it's particularly in the engineering parts of Google where there was sort of the 5th day rule, where you work on your assigned project or your assigned task or your assigned job for 4 days, and you spend a 5th day working on something different. Go find another group and see if you can help them. Go work on a different project that's completely orthogonal to what your actual role is. But as a way of stimulating creativity and stimulating innovation, that 5th day, do something different. And just to sort of borrow that, I get worried about people becoming too sort of routinized and automated in their jobs, and too focused on their roles and their personal sort of, to-do lists, as it were, that they sort of forget about who they're working with. So if the 5th day is you sort of step away from the mirror, you step away from the agenda, you step away from your to-do list, and you say, I'm just going to spend some time listening and thinking about how the group around me, the group that I interact with, the group that I, am home based in at work, how are they doing? How is this group performing? Not how am I performing, but how is this group performing? So the question is, could we afford to spend, 20% of our time really focused on that and not focused on our OKRs, right? People familiar with the objectives and key results thing? It's very popular around here in Silicon Valley. And it's kind of, the reminder is that the OKR model, objectives and key results, only works if you also have the CFRs, which are the conversations, the feedback, and the recognition. You can't have OKRs if you don't have CFRs. And so my idea about, could you say, all right, 20% of the time, I'm really going to focus on, that conversation, that recognition, to see if I can improve the way the group is functioning, not the way I'm functioning. So, and now I want to shift to that other mindfulness question that Ed raises that he loves, the Ellen Langer question. It didn't trigger, so it's the question of what's different today. So do you want to elaborate?
Just that our consciousness is so much greater than what we focus on. And the quick story is one night we had an emergency with a grandchild and had a horrible, drive to a hospital and back and so on. The next day, my wife and I were talking to Ellen Langer, and she said, "What's going on?" We told her this horrible story. And she looked quizzically at us and said, "Well, you mean you were in a car with your granddaughter for 3 hours to the hospital and 3 hours back? What was going on all this time?" And then the fog lifted, and my wife and I realized we had had 6 delightful hours with this 3-year-old and chose to tell how horrible the drive was instead of saying, we got to know our granddaughter. Because we were trapped in the situation. She was delightful. She entertained us. Why did we choose to talk about the awful drive?
I have one more question, then we're going to turn to questions from the audience. Many of us doing this work in transformation and are committed to the kind of level 3 and values that you're talking about can get dismayed by the scale of how organizations are not human, or -1, or how we're living in a system that might be promoting fear. So I would love to know what's just feeding your optimism as you face the work you're doing and promote it in the world, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience.
Well, I'll take a quick crack at that. What's feeding my optimism is that Peter and I are both being used by the Stanford Hospital and the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital in their improvement domain. They both have senior VPs of improvement and quality, and those folks are really, with the support of the CEOs, working hard to make life better for patients, to make life better for employees, and to use all the OD tools we know to improve the functioning of that hospital. And to the extent that I see that going on in other organizations, that they have an improvement department, a good safety department, that they're really concerned about employees and customers. I think percentage-wise, that's still a small percentage, but that's where I want to put my focus. Maybe healthcare will invent some things that business might eventually adopt.
And
why are you optimistic?
Well,
Peter?
I guess I would say that I feel like the mindset of most of the sort of 20 to 25-year-olds that I meet today is very different from the mindset of a lot of the 20 to 25-year-olds that I interacted with in the 80s. I think that there are powerful and constructive value shifts that I think are happening. I hope I'm not wrong. I hope we don't go back to the Gordon Gekko greed is good era of the 80s, because I don't know why we'd ever go back there. But so I do think there's a positive shift that's happened, and the future's in the 20-year-olds, and I'm encouraged by kind of the energy and the spirit that I get, and I have 2 daughters that age, so I'm speaking with a familial bias, but with some experience of that mindset, and I think it's positive.
Good. Maybe we'll get a 3-generation book out of you guys yet.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Who has a question for Ed or Peter? There's a question over here. Do we have? Why don't you just say the question and I will repeat it.
It's how they would apply these concepts to inclusion work and diversity and building relationships with someone who is very much the other,
Right.
and maybe the only other.
Right. The question is about, did you hear that question? About how?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it. So
Okay.
Ed, the question is, if we think of, I'll paraphrase, if we think about the relationship model in particular and how it relates to diversity and inclusion and equity work. And I guess for me, the simple, unfortunately, hopefully this isn't grounded in theory and not reality, but is if you really truly are valuing that whole person to whole person relationship, you can't afford to be living with an unconscious bias. If you're actually trying to connect with another person, human to human, you'll get through that. There'll be attitude differences, whether it's race, identity, ethnicity, age, all of those things are relevant. But if you're actually trying to create a whole person to whole person connection with somebody, you will get over those. Those are things that'll be part of your relationship. But if you agree that your goal is to trust each other and be open with each other, you're not going to let unconscious bias get in the way of that. It's, again, it's sort of, for all of us have had that experience of, that kind of interpersonal breakthrough. You have to believe that that's where, humans at work are going to get. And I think it's harder at scale when you're saying we need to create diversity at a global scale. But if CEOs or senior leadership are expressing that value, I think you do get there.
I could just add a point that we haven't really talked about the problems of tribalism and intergroup conflict, because a lot of the diversity problems arise out of maintaining your identity in your own group, and that requires you to hate another group. That's very much a real phenomenon. But the good news is that in those situations where people who have really worked at the intergroup level have discovered that the only way you break down these tribal biases is by getting the people from the different tribes together to tell their own personal stories. That debates don't work, but telling personal stories of who I am and why I'm in this tribe and how I see the world, and hearing the other party also in a context of trust and openness say where they're coming from, that seems to be the one way that some of those deep hatreds begin to at least be understood, if not ameliorated.
Other questions? Question over here. There's a mic coming down to you or around. Hold on one second. Thank you so much. Here it comes. Maybe stand up. Thanks.
Thank you. Friedrich speaking. If you walk down the halls of a larger organization and you have a couple of conversations, What's your personal indicators to find out if it's a level 1 or level 2 organization?
Well, I think the first reaction I have is I wouldn't even try to judge the whole organization. I would only judge that the 3 people I've met seem to be easier and listen to me or each other or whatever. And I would then maybe formulate the hypothesis in my head, this feels pretty good, but I would be aware that that might be just true of that department or that group. I think we know enough about the diversity within organizations between even the subcultures at different levels, the technical culture, the social culture, that they could be operating at different levels of relationship. So I would only really believe that the organization is level 2 if I saw this happening at the board and the CEO and executive suite level. Because if it doesn't start there, you may find pockets of it, but it won't necessarily filter upward.
And I'd just like to add a quick little story. We were doing some work with a fairly big organization, global footprint, that we were doing some interviews and talking about how how the organization works, how things are going. And we immediately started hearing the term silos. And we hadn't said anything about silos. They brought it up. The issue was what they were describing were functional specialties, but they used the term silo. And that made me think, okay, well, there's something going on here, that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in some respect, that we're, as if to say we're admitting that we're completely silo bound, not that we have a bunch of functional specialties and we're trying to figure out how to interact better. So that was a signal that if they're using that term, then we've got more work to do. We need to try to convince them that no, what you've got is an appropriate organizational design with functional specialties. You just have to stop thinking of them as silos.
Question on that side. Oh, thank you.
Hi. So you mentioned Frederick Laloux earlier, and a couple of us are in a rising practitioner circle and reading Reinventing Organizations. And I'm wondering about how, 2 things. One, like the teal organization, how that gels with the intimate Navy SEALs and the autocrats, and if there is some sort of parallel or way to interpret those two concepts. And then also with the level 3 organization, I could see that becoming like sort of like a green. I'm sorry I'm using nerdy vocabulary, and I hope that that's useful for people even who haven't read the book. But that it's not the potential to like sort of collapse inward and like we're a family, but then it becoming confusing.
Right. Well, I guess I would say my first thought is that we tend, in our thinking, have tended to associate the teal organization with a level 2. And I guess to your point that if it becomes too familial, if it becomes too close, too intimate, then does it sort of, I think that's a good term, collapse on itself. So again, we are associating teal with level 2, where there's a sort of a belief in we're going to bring our whole person to work, and we're going to be accepted as our whole person. We're going to be open and trusting with each other. We like to think of those as as kind of the hallmarks of teal, whereas the kind of intimacy that we would see in like a SEAL team or in a tiny startup. I think those are, in a way, sort of more situationally appropriate, Whereas that level of intimacy, I think at a large organization at scale, we wouldn't say that that was necessarily always situationally appropriate.
You know, one of the very first things that I learned from my mentor, Douglas McGregor, was the principle that how you manage, management style, leadership style, is a function of the task you're performing. There is no best way to lead or worst way to lead, except in relation to what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So the teal organization, in my mind, is a reflection of the statement that the world is more interconnected and complex. And the problems that leaders have to face are, as you've said so well in adaptive leadership, are ones that require a different kind of relationship between the head of an organization and the people in the organization. But it's the task that's driving that, not some absolute humanistic value. The humanism is an important value, but is not the driving value in my view. The driving value is pragmatism. We can't solve problems anymore in the old level one way that used to work beautifully for factories and assembly lines and whatnot. We have to invent new forms of organization and new relationships inside those organizations to make the world work. That's the important argument, not whether it's better to be teal or not. It's what do you have to be to solve the problems of the world.
Great. We got one more last question on this side.
Good day, John from Sydney. If everything that you do is an intervention, do you ever come across a situation where your early interventions may reveal the client, the organization can't be helped right now through process consultation? Does that ever happen? And if it does, how do you respond to that?
It happens, unfortunately, all too often when you realize that the client wanted something other than help. They wanted approval, they wanted a sounding board, they just wanted to lament. They didn't really come to the helper with an attitude of, I need something in the way of help. So if somebody comes to me, and this is the worst case, with I want your help, and here's what we've done, what do you think of it? Just the hardest case, where I suddenly realize then they present me a huge program designed for something, and what do I think of it? I know I'm in trouble because 9 times out of 10, I think it's horrible, and they've made mistakes all along the way. And I know that if I say that, they're just going to dismiss me as a consultant. So I try to get out of those by saying, I will not become a judge of what you do. I will not evaluate your people. I will not evaluate your programs if I sense that that's what they're after. And if you still want to talk, fine. But if you're putting me in a position of just making judgments or evaluations, I have to back out. I won't be able to help you. I don't know if that helps with your question, but that has happened to me on a number of occasions. And I've just had to sever the relationship. I don't think everybody can be helped. I think a lot of people claim they want help, but that's not what they want at all.
The other thing that I wanted to add is that we published this book in July, and the reason there's a wave on the cover is that we wanted to sort of describe the culture change leadership process as something that's iterative and wave-like and takes a while. So we're we're trying to get off the idea of a linear transformation and more on an iterative, continuous, wave-like transformation metaphor, so that you don't feel like that, well, maybe that first iteration or that first intervention didn't do much or didn't change much or didn't, wasn't met with receptive ears. But, subsequent interventions might be. And, over time, that we think of change as a continuous and reciprocal process, not as something that we can assign to a linear stepwise function.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
yes. Okay. Well, we want to thank you in a moment. I'll ask people to applaud in one moment. But I have no capacity of imagination to understand how the waves you've created in your work has affected all of the work we're doing in this room. And I just want to thank you for that personally and for the collective space. I think it's extraordinary what you've done, both then. I think it's beautiful the work you're doing now. And it's just very also personally touching to see the kind of relationship that two generations can have. So just help me thank you and sort of applaud. Thank you so much.